Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Gail Geller. I'm a professor in the Berman Institute of Bioethics and in the Department of Medicine. And I have the honor of having the opportunity of introducing our guest speaker today. I'm delighted that Dr. Arthur Kleinman has agreed to join us for a couple of days. I'm sure many of you know Dr. Kleinman very well, but for those of you who don't, he is a world-renowned psychiatrist and medical anthropologist at Harvard. We sometimes say the other H. He's a graduate of Stanford University and Stanford Medical School, and he received his master's in social anthropology from Harvard. He did his internship at Yale and then trained in psychiatry at the Mass General Hospital. When I say we often refer to the other H, there are many, many things that Hopkins is wonderful about and at, as you know. But there are a couple of things I think that we can really look to our Northeast colleague to emulate. And one is the program in medical anthropology that they have. They have a department of social medicine. These are things that we don't have at Hopkins, and I think we might do well to consider creating them. I know that there is activity afoot at the Homewood campus now in creating a program in medical anthropology and a new major in medicine, science, and the humanities. So I look forward to following the progress of those new developments, but I think Dr. Kleinman has a whole lot to teach us in that regard. In 1982, he inaugurated Harvard's PhD program in medical anthropology. He has served as the chair of both the Department of Social Medicine and the Department of Anthropology at Harvard. He's currently professor of medical anthropology and professor of psychiatry in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine. Dr. Kleinman is unarguably the world's leading expert in cross-cultural psychiatry and particularly well known for his work on mental illness in Chinese culture. He currently serves as the director of the Harvard University Asia Center. He's also written on the intersection of public health and international issues, as well as social suffering and the individual experience of pain and disability, which is probably closer to what he will speak to us about today. Dr. Kleinman is the author of 6 books, co-author of 2 others, co-editor of nearly 30 volumes and 8 special issues of journals, and author of over 300 articles, book chapters, reviews, and introductions. Perhaps his most influential work is Patients and Healers in the Context of Culture, The Illness Narratives, Suffering, Healing, and the Human Condition, and Social Origins of Distress and Disease, Depression, Neurasthenia, and Pain in Modern China. He has professional memberships and awards way too numerous to mention. He has supervised more than 75 PhD students, more than 200 postdoctoral fellows, and taught decades of medical students at Harvard. He also has had numerous influences on people he doesn't know, like me. I had the pleasure of spending a few minutes with Dr. Kleinman earlier this morning, and I told him about a very memorable talk I heard him give at Homewood a number of years ago, in which he talked about anger, and he referred to anger as the equivalent of moral outrage, that often when people are angry, it's because they have felt wronged, and that has really had an enormous influence on how I deal with people who are angry in my life and my own anger. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kleinman.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and talk to you. I wear a number of hats, as many of you do, and we live in the age of task sharing. So today I want to address the issue of caregiving as moral experience, which is more in line with what I've come to understand the medical humanities are about. But I've given this talk at most of America's major medical schools. And so if you have any questions, you don't hesitate to interrupt me, and I'll do it in a courteous way. But I'll respond to whatever your particular interests are. Now, these are some of the books that I've written or contributed to, and I show them because there's several that actually show that my interest in caregiving is is long-standing, and starting with the book you heard about Patients and Healers in the Context of Culture, but also in my Tanner lectures at Stanford in the late 90s, and in my 2006 book, What Really Matters. And even in the book that Paul Farmer, Jim Kim, Matt Basilico, and I edited, Reimagining Global Health, my part of that is on caregiving. And right now, as you see from your right, I'm just finishing a book called Taking Care, Life's Cares and Caregiving. But what's important to recognize in this talk and in the and with respect to this long background I've had, is that my life changed entirely in the early 2000s when my wife developed Alzheimer's disease and I was the primary caregiver. And so part of what I'm going to talk about, and I'll actually illustrate it, is my own experience as a family caregiver, which not only deepened, but also shook up my research views and my own clinical views of what caregiving is about. So what is caregiving? If we look up in the OED, we see that the emphasis is really on the needs of others and attending to those needs, which is not a bad way to think of caregiving. But if we look at caregiving ethnographically, that is what an anthropologist does, to put yourself into a world and describe what's happening in that world. Then we see that caregiving can both be an individual but also a collective experience. And that it's about things like the very practical support that we give, and I'll go into some detail on this, protecting others, solidarity with them, and that has a range of dimensions, from the highly physical to the highly emotional, from the interpersonal to the moral. And it's important to recognize, as I talk to you about these things, that it would be a terrible irony if caregiving were to obliterate the process of care receiving, because caregiving is so fundamentally interpersonal that the best model of it is an exchange. And there's something that the care receiver gives in return for what the caregiver gives. And it's not just money. Now, although I'm going to spend my time here on the more clinical dimension of caregiving, there are other parts of caregiving that are equally important. We can see humanitarian assistance as caregiving at the collective level. And in fact, we're right now in the middle of the epidemic on Ebola. Two of my former students, Jim Kim and Paul Farmer, are leading that fight. Jim at the World Bank, Paul out in Liberia itself. And their work can be seen as part of caregiving within humanitarian assistance. Professional caregiving is what we learn to do as doctors, nurses, social workers, physical therapists. Self-care is critically important to caregiving, although it's easy to critique self-care because it fits so nicely with the neoliberal economic policies of our time and the tendency to press things onto individuals and make them be responsible for everything. Nonetheless, self-care is an extremely important part of what caregiving is about. I'll talk about self-care, family and network care, and professional caregiving. I'm not going to talk about folk and religious caregiving, but they're very important. And you'll see many of the images I'm going to give you are of Asia, and I don't feel at all self-conscious about that, because since Asian societies and populations make up more than 60% of the world's population, it's a better population to generalize from than our own population, which makes up such a small portion of the world's population. So caregiving and the core tasks for family, close friends, and sufferers themselves include practical assistance. And anyone who's done anything in the family to take care of the elderly, to participate in dementia care, to to help someone who's had a stroke, heart disease, even in serious chronic illness like diabetes, knows that they're very practical things which are the centerpiece of caregiving. Feeding, bathing, ambulating, toileting, protecting. But these actually practical things are also clearly an essential part of nursing, what nursing is about. And many of these acts have in the past been critical to medicine, to what physicians have done. And if you think of the physician equivalents of this, the laying on of hands, the doing of the physical exam, the supporting, the things that put you in very, very close contact with patients on the physical level, that's part of practical assistance, what I mean by it. But the two moral acts, and they are fundamentally moral, that are a crucial part of what caregiving is in families and what professional caregiving is, or at least should be, and traditionally has been. And those are acknowledgement and affirmation. And not acknowledging the person as a human being, as a person in need, as someone who needs assistance, and affirming their right to have that position, and the importance of their receiving care, and of their status. This is true of professional care as well. We think of the patient-doctor relationship. Even an ethicist like Emmanuel Levinas once said that affirmation and acknowledgement precede the medical epistemological act of saying, what's wrong with you? What are your symptoms? Before that act of interrogation comes the act of who the other is. And you're going to see in my critique that I believe we're losing this today. And we're turning medicine and nursing and virtually all the other health professions into something between technology and the kind of thing a mechanic would do with your car. Most mechanics working with a car don't affirm the human status of the car. It doesn't have a human status other than in your hands. They don't go into acknowledging any aspect of that car other than what the problem is. But that's what differentiates us from technicians and mechanics and technologists. Now, there are additional core tasks of caregiving that I don't have time to go into. They're all important. But we'll mention one, and that's on the bottom of the slide here, presence. Presence is an enormously important idea that we have tended to downplay in the health professions. Presence is your becoming, your being, you're opening yourself up to be fully human. The way I am before you now, and I could give this lecture mechanically just like any of you could. Go through the motions and give it. You'd hear something, you could write it down, you'd walk out of here, and you'd have no impression of who I was, why this mattered to me. Presence is being there. It's being there with you. It's showing that you're fully alive and you're with that person. Presence is what many of us most appreciate when we learn to take care of patients. Being present for them. The new student finds himself or herself in awe, frequently, of sick people, and loses that in the course of training, in professional training. We'll come back to that. But it's very important to recognize presence is not just professional presence. It's presence in a family, in a network. It's being present with another person. You all know this. You can be present with your kids or with your parents, and you can be mechanical. Now, I want to define caregiving in the most basic of ways, of human ways, as an existential act that defines our very humanity and our relationships with others. That it's one of the things that matters most. Matters most not just in a health science setting, in a professional setting, but in life. It's a basic response to the context of danger and uncertainty that defines the human condition. We happen to live in a society which, in its cultural dimensions, is characterized by playing down the dangers and uncertainties of life. That's the Hollywood side of our society. Plays those things down. That's why we emphasize words that most societies laugh at, like resilience. Most of us who've gone through a life, I'm in my 8th decade, know that resilience is euphemistic for endurance. Life is about enduring. It's about one damn thing after another and getting through those things. It's about being able to keep going and still keep a sense of yourself and the world, trying to do the best you can, trying to work with others. It's not a romantic experience. It's a practical experience. And danger and uncertainty are with us all the time. Now, caregiving is portrayed by economists and psychologists as a burden, but that's an incomplete understanding, in my own view, of interviewing hundreds and hundreds of caregivers in my own personal experience. Yes, there's a burdensome side to caregiving. It can be very burdensome, can try us as much as we can be tried. And there are people for whom it's only a burden. But it's a way of being. That's the way most caregivers describe it. If you really want to read something in this regard that's interesting, read E.S. Goldman, the great New Yorker writer, who wrote a book on caregiving for his wife who had Alzheimer's. The book is called The Caregiver. He wrote it under a pseudonym, Aaron Altera. And I wrote the preface to the second edition of it. But read E.S. Goldman. Goldman says, when asked by people why he kept doing what he did, which was to care for his wife much as I did over a long period of time, he said, well, I never really thought about it. It was there to do. It was there to do. I did it. It was a way of being in the world. It was just that, the way you are. And I think for many people who do caregiving, that's the way it is. However, some people, and it's important to realize this, and there even are some books on this, feel coerced into caregiving. In society, I do a lot of my research in Chinese society. There's very strong pressure to be seen not as un-Confucian. The basis of Confucian thought and practice is taking care of older people. Hence, if you don't do that, you're seen as not reflecting the virtues of the Confucian tradition. In our society, we have plenty of people who feel, just like many Chinese do, that they're literally coerced into caregiving because of expectations around them, but not because their heart is really in it, for a variety of reasons that we can understand. Bad relationships, difficult times, a sense that you're doing all you can do just to keep going and can't take on something else. In a global culture of cynicism, where there's a widespread sense of misplaced loyalty, caregiving is frequently perceived as one of the truly worthy objects of ethical commitment. Now, on a practical level, if we simply do a quantitative study of the arenas of caregiving and acts of care, then we find that caregiving has relatively little to do with medicine, or even in the big picture, the helping professions, because most of it, the vast majority of it, is done by partners, children, families, and the wider social network. I want to illustrate some aspects of caregiving before I get to the relationship of caregiving specifically to medicine. I took this picture, I took this slide from a wonderful exhibit by the contemporary artist Christopher Williams at MoMA in New York City, in a set of works that he called The Production of Happiness. And what Williams is showing here is a woman who's fallen down, but she's quite attractive and she's very well dressed. And he's showing that the person observing, rather than responding and picking her up, is checking with a light meter whether he has the right picture that he can take before he'll do something. But that notion, in a sense, that we're observers at a distance and that we're checking light meters, or no longer needing light meters given our cell phone cameras, that we're taking pictures without practicing, without doing something, is something I want to emphasize. I also want to emphasize on the self-care side the fact that what you often hear, which is that people are unaware of caregiving as they receive care and as they produce their own self-care, as they get into very, very serious problems in medicine, should be a thought that you hold in brackets, because it's usually wrong. This is a great Swiss artist, William Uetermohlen, who developed Alzheimer's disease. And he painted his own Alzheimer's disease right up to near the end. He continued painting what he felt and what he saw himself becoming. That gives you a sense that subjectivity is there in people, no matter how destroyed they are psychologically, cognitively. The long historical dimension of caregiving has, in the Western tradition, a very strong religious side. And in our society, where 70% of Americans believe that God is active in their lives, and 90% believe in God, unlike virtually all other developed societies, we should pay a lot of attention to religion. So this is a picture of the central role, historically, that nuns play in caregiving. This is a picture from Rembrandt of the interpersonal structure of caregiving and the domesticity of it. This is caregiving. I like to show this painting because Ephraim Bueno, who Rembrandt painted, was a noted Portuguese Jewish doctor in Amsterdam and was known for his compassion. And Rembrandt tried to paint it in his face. And you can see in that compassion a kind of sadness, recognizing the tragedies that caregiving is often about. And this is another painting that's very important for me personally, and this is Goya's great depiction of his own deathly illness. He recovered from this, and he attributed his recovery to a great friend of his who was a physician. But given the remedies of the time, the potion that he's being given probably wasn't necessarily the thing that got him better. What Goya conveys here, it's a little hard to see it, if you see this great painting, it's worth paying attention to, is that the friend's face, the doctor's face, is cherubic, it's red, and the patient's face is devoid of all color. It's pale, deathly. And what he gives you a sense of is the doctor transmitting through his presence his vitality to the patient. That's what presence is about. Everyone, I think, probably in this room knows the great painting by Sir Luke Fildes of the doctor. And the way we generally see it is here we are at the end of the 19th century. This girl probably is in the crisis of high fever due to infectious disease. Doctor is puzzled over the pathophysiology, but he's there, he's present. His presence is the moral act of caregiving. Actually, Picasso caught this. This is a great Picasso painting in Barcelona, in the Picasso Museum, in which he fused the head of the caregiver and the patient. He fused the heads. That the caregiving is right in the patient and the care receiving in the caregiver. It's an interpersonal structure. And the great religious, Western religious icon of that, of course, is the Pietà, the dying or dead Christ in the arms of the Virgin, with caregiving in the space between them. Modern depiction of caregiving, this is pictures from Partners in Health's MDR-TB program in Lesotho of patients dying with combined TB and HIV, surrounded by families. And now I want to show my personal example, and this is my wedding day, and my wife, Joan, my late wife. This is Joan and I was young, when I was young. See how you can change over a period of time. This is Joan, midlife, the two of us in midlife. This is Joan in our garden, in our late 50s. This is Joan with Alzheimer's disease, which she had for 10 years, when I took care of her. And this is Joan on her deathbed with Alzheimer's. By her as she died. And that's her gravestone in Mount Auburn Cemetery. Now, I want to take all this as background and ask the question, where is caregiving in medicine today? And I want to look at several paradoxes. I want to say that there's a paradoxical place of caregiving in today's medicine, that there is a paradox in the way we think of caregiving and actually deal with it in medical education. Then I want to ask a question as to whether there's a paradoxical impact of scientific and technological development in medicine such that they, in some ways, deprofessionalize us or make it more difficult for us to do caregiving. There's no reason they should be that way, but I'm going to ask the question whether they are, in fact. So the first paradox. Medicine traditionally defines caregiving as central to the practice of the doctor, but over time caregiving has become less central to medical practice. The paradox is we don't spend sufficient time or money on caregiving, either in practice or in curriculum, yet we still consider it central to what medicine does. Medical students are both more interested in and better at the practical, emotional, and moral aspects of caregiving when they enter medical school than when they graduate. We know this from 4 empirical studies at least, in 4 different medical schools. The earliest one at the Oregon Medical School, the Oregon Health Sciences School, which demonstrated in 1980s, what's now been demonstrated at other schools as well, that if you simply compare first year and fourth year medical students on the history, on taking history from patients, the fourth year medical students are better on the technical details of the history. Thank God for that, otherwise we'd wonder what in the world we're getting paid for as medical educators. But the first year students are much better, not a little better, but much better at the emotional and psychosocial dimensions of history taking. They do a better job on the family history, on the personal history, on relating the history to the person's life. Now, there's no reason in the world why that should be the case, but it points to a disabling function of medical school, and I would generalize it and say health professional schools in general. That we're, at the same time that we're becoming technologically more enabled, we're becoming humanly disabled. The paradox here is this suggests there's something about medical education that disinterests and disables students from caregiving. So I have at many of America's medical schools proposed a Swiftian proposal. Now you remember that Jonathan Swift, during the Irish famine, came up with what he called a modest proposal. And he did that because Swift felt that the English were not responding to the famine. And he wanted people to be outraged by the famine and to respond to how horrible it was. And so to outrage people, his modest proposal was that parents should be allowed to eat the children. Because if they eat the children, then they didn't have to watch the children die slowly of starvation, and also they themselves would survive. There was, of course, a tremendous outrage to that, and that's exactly what he wanted. And I can tell you, I've suggested the same, in a sense, equivalent. Why don't we drop caregiving from the curriculum of physicians and hand it over to nurses who in fact do most of it, home health aides, social workers, and families, and just say doctors can be excluded from caregiving. And if we wanted to go further, and when nurses want to emulate doctors in some ways, we can even exclude nurses from caregiving. Now, when I have said this at grand rounds in departments of medicine around the country, or speeches introduced by the deans of medical schools, as soon as I say this, hands go up in the audience. And I take those responses and they go like this. That's a ridiculous idea, Doc. I mean, how can you have an idea like that? Caregiving is what we are about. We don't, it would be absurd for us to give up caregiving. Or people say very angrily, this is, just the most dangerous idea you could present to us. And I said, gee, it's a wonderful response. I'm so delighted with it. Now, how much time in the curriculum is devoted to caregiving? When students are selected for your medical school, are they selected with attention to their potential to be good caregivers? Are they examined in medical school with the same detail and the same seriousness and rigor as they are on science in terms of caregiving? Are they flunked out of medical school if they don't have the skills to be caregivers? There's generally more of a silence at that time, sometimes a defensive response, but you get the message. I think that we just don't pay the attention we should to this. And I can tell you that some years ago, I took a group of Harvard medical students around, I do a lot of clinical, I used to do a lot of clinical teaching at Harvard, around the Brigham and Women's Hospital, one of our hospitals, and I was interviewing patients for them, and then we'd have a talk. And then finally one of the medical students said to me, one of the Harvard medical students said to me, Dr. Kleinman, we're the wrong students for you. We were selected here to come to Harvard on the basis of our cognitive skills, not because we had any interpersonal skills. And, I think my school is now trying to do a better job of selecting for high cognitive skills, but also with some attention, some more attention for interpersonal skills. Now, I can also show you that health reform in a number of ways has actually worsened, not improved caregiving in medicine. Technology has come to dominate our understanding of healthcare, replacing or diminishing the human acts of caregiving. The electronic medical record, early in my career, I worked on the origins of sort of the beginning of the electronic medical record, has become highly important for efficiency, evaluation, and reliability, but often there's no place in the record, and this doesn't have to be the case, but it's just the way it is. There's no place in the record to include information about illness narrative, about the experience of healthcare, about the tasks of caregiving. You'd be hard-pressed in most medical records to find the old great nursing notes, which oriented every intern and resident and physician to what was going on with patients. They're hard to find today in the electronic record, at least in Boston. The fragmentation and time compression in care in institutional settings works against the impulse to stop, listen, and be present for the patient. Now, I show this picture because it's the only time Picasso ever painted the head of a medical student. And he made a note that the emphasis should be placed in interpreting it on one eye open and one eye closed. And the interpretation that many art historians and medical educators have had is that Picasso meant that when the student comes to medical school, both eyes are open. Students, early students, beginning students, have a sense of awe in front of the experience, patient's experience of illness, and taking of the history. But over time, one eye closes. In part, we understand that, because you have to have professional distance to be able to be an effective professional. But on the other hand, Picasso is suggesting, many believe, that in the process of medical education, perhaps both eyes will close. So at the end, it's self-interest of the physician that becomes more important than interest in the patient. That's why former student and colleague, actually now the chair of my department, Paul Farmer, says something that I fully agree with, which is that when you take care of patients, it's the suffering of the patient that counts more, or should count more, than your own suffering. Your own suffering is not unimportant, but it's the patient's suffering that should count the most. Now, what can we do, in the little time I have left, what can we do to revitalize caregiving in medicine? And I'm very, very serious about this because I believe we have to, we must, and we will. Now, first of all, some years ago, about 5, 6 years ago, I was the Cleveringa professor at the University of Leiden. The Leiden Medical School, you remember, was a great medical school in the 17th and 18th centuries, but still is a serious medical school in Holland. And they do a wonderful thing with their first-year students, which I've been trying to get schools in the United States to pick up. And that is that every first-year student, at the beginning of their year, their first year in medical school, is placed in the home of a seriously disabled or terminal patient who's in bad shape. And they're asked to do nothing medical. Nothing medical. Because after all, they don't know anything medical. They're asked simply to assist with the feeding, the bathing, the dressing, the toileting, the ambulating. They wash the dishes, they make the bed, they scrub the bathroom. I spoke to dozens of physicians at Leiden. It's a very sort of internally bred school. Many people stay on for their training. So they all said that this was the single most important experience of their medical school. It was the time they spent in the homes of the disabled. And I think every medical student should do that. That gives the sense of what the setting, the domestic setting we saw Rembrandt portray of care is about. Then students could be asked to write what might be called a mini ethnography, if that's not an oxymoron, of a patient in the context of their family and their social network. Trying to simply describe what the family setting and the social network setting is, and how that social context might be affecting the person and their illness. Learning collaborative teamwork with nurses, physical therapists, and home health aides to encourage respect and collegiality is absolutely central to the kind of world of care that most doctors are going into. And again, many medical schools spend very, very little time on this. Longitudinal clinical experiences in home health care. A number of schools are doing this, and I think this is very important. And then systematic evaluation of caregiving skills of students throughout the program and testing on it. And if you don't pass, you don't go on. That's the seriousness. And then, from the standpoint of those of you who have been department chairs or know something about administration of a university, devoting greater resources, financial and personnel, to this area. Building caregiving process measures into the electronic medical record. Evaluating these skills as central to the competence of the clinician. Developing and funding research on process and outcomes of caregiving. And there's a whole set of policy implications of building caregiving into the way we do healthcare policy. So I'll tell you about some, let me just mention some just to give you a sense of what I mean. I'm doing a major project with the World Bank right now about funding global mental health. We're going to have a big meeting of the funders to sort of make it possible to take packages of mental health interventions in very poor societies and get them generalized. And one of the things I've discovered in doing this is how many health policy people actually are biased against the mental health field. If you have them fill out Mazarin Banerjee's inherent implicit bias scale, almost all of them would have a bias against the health field. I think if you take a caregiving approach generally, you can more readily criticize yourself, pick up that bias, and do something about it. And the last point is simply to incentivize caregiving in every way we can, to do a better job in educating in the very core skills of caregiving. And let me tell you what I mean by this for physicians. The physical exam is going out the window in medical school. Many medical schools make physicians feel inconfident about using a stethoscope, since they can use other devices, including an electronic stethoscope, which does a better job than personal use of the stethoscope. But if these skills go out the window, so does a lot of caregiving, which is about putting on of hands, doing the physical exam in a way that makes the patient understand that you're taking care of them, that you're doing something for them. Going beyond bureaucratic protocols, and this is where I think that algorithms, treatment algorithms, and best practices are necessary, but not sufficient. They have to be complemented constantly by the human side of care. They cannot be seen in and of themselves as what care is about. Emphasizing not just understanding medical ethics, as important as it is, but also recognizing that the training of the physician, and for that matter the nurse and the physical therapist, is a moral training, And spending time on that moral education. Actually, I'd go beyond that, since I've given this talk to many universities at large. This is true of the university at large, whether you're an undergraduate or a graduate student. There's a part of what you do that is a moral training. And then complementing an economic language which has come to dominate all aspects of healthcare and our policy debates with a clinical caregiving language that can be projected into the policy arena. Anyone who's been alive and attentive to the healthcare policy debates of the last decade knows that there has been hardly any projection of clinical concerns in a language that policymakers can themselves engage. We've really failed in that regard. That's something that additionally needs to be improved. So let me end by just saying that there's no reason to think that we must give up caregiving. There's no reason to think that we should put up with the situation that we're in. There's every reason to believe that we can make a difference and we can change things. And that change begins with all of us, every single one of us, in the way that we practice, in the way that we teach, and what we stand for. And if you're in the health domain and you don't stand for caregiving, then ask yourself, what do you stand for? Thank you very much.
We have about 15 minutes for questions. Dr. Kleinman, would you feel?
Sure, I'm very happy to take questions. Yes.
Thank you for your talk.
Just a little loud because I
Okay,
can't
yeah.
hear it.
Oh, there's a microphone.
Hello.
Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering if I think you touched upon it a little bit in your talk in regards to somewhat the negative side of caregiving, the burden of caregiving.
Yeah.
I'm a public health person, and so I'm a little bit more distant from the patient, so I can't really attest to my personal experience of caregiving. But it seems to be that there are a lot of social workers, especially in these programs, who experience burnout syndrome. And so I was wondering if you could comment on the argument that in some ways the negative aspect of caregiving can contribute to burning out, especially like if you're dealing with terminally ill patients or...
Yeah, well, it's, for someone who, since you've self-defined yourself as not someone in caregiving, you made a very important point. It's a very important point. And so, first of all, I was speaking earlier about this, that if you speak to people who burn out professionally, they'll often tell you that they have kind of lost their ability to empathize, to be compassionate, and to be engaged. And when you ask them about, well, how'd you lose that? They almost want to cry. They feel so bad. They say, somehow, the way I'm giving care, the situation I'm in terms of the structure of delivery, prevents me from doing that. Now let me say that just think about the structure of delivery. And think of it in our country and more broadly. The average follow-up visit in a primary care setting for a patient with chronic illness in the United States is 11 minutes. The average time given to a patient to express their own concerns and what's wrong with them in that visit is 19 seconds. You could be the most effective communicator in the world, but you're probably not going to be at the highest level of when you're seriously ill, and still have difficulty effectively getting across in 11 seconds. I'm sorry, 19 seconds. What's wrong with you? But there's no question about the fact that 11 minutes is entirely inadequate for the care of a seriously ill patient. Just think of a seriously ill patient. I have very specific kinds of patients in mind. Take a 57-year-old woman who has maternity onset diabetes, has had the onset of peripheral vascular problems in her feet and toes, has already had eye ground changes in her retinal exam and trouble seeing, is worried about heart disease, and herself has had difficulty controlling her blood sugar. Think about, that's a very common patient. Just think about that patient, their anxiety, their concerns, and think about 11 minutes for the interaction. In that 11 minutes, the physician has to go through what's happened between the last visit and this visit. Has to have a real sense of what the present concern is and bring a structure of clinical relevance to that concern. Has to deal with all of these problems and come up with some kind of solution framework. I think it's very difficult to do those things and do the kinds of things that I'm asking for as part of the human side of caregiving in 11 minutes. Now, years ago, I introduced something that is now being taught in, I'd say, at least 3/4 of American medical schools. It's probably the thing most associated with my name in medicine. And that's a part of an interview called the Explanatory Models interview, where I simply introduced 8 questions that medical students, physicians, nurses could use with patients, just to open up a conversation, to get a sense of context and person. Those questions I just told you are used in 3/4 of American medical schools. But when I visit these medical schools, and because I'm a clinician, I'm taken on rounds, and we see patients together. This is usually the way that a person is presented to me with explanatory models. It goes like this. Here's a 74-year-old man after a heart attack. This is his EKG. This is his electrolytes. This is his hematocrit. And this is his explanatory model. Okay? And the explanatory model is presented as a substance, as if it had become entified. And it's fixed in some way and put down, like anything else we put into the record. That's not at all what I meant by the explanatory model. I meant that it would open up a conversation rather than defeat a conversation. But that's what happens with it. So that's why you have to have attention constantly to caregiving interactions. Now, to just show you, as bad as it sounds for us, it's much worse in many other places. So you go to East Asia, and the average time for that same visit, that follow-up visit in primary care settings for a patient is under 3 minutes. There are places in East Asia actually where it's under 2 minutes. That means that you barely get a sentence out about what's wrong with you when the doctor starts writing the prescription. So you can understand in that setting what kind of care is that. Now, years ago, having written about that in China and having criticized American approaches to care as inadequate in this regard, I wrote that care increasingly was becoming veterinary. And I was attacked, appropriately so, by the American Veterinary Association, which insisted that vets actually have a much better sense of their animals than most doctors and nurses do of their patients. So you won't hear me use that now. Yes, right back there. You can wait for so I can hear you. Yeah.
Thank you. That was really brilliant, and I really appreciated hearing that. And since you're addressing your talk to all healthcare professionals, I wanted to ask you your opinion on how we're being evaluated currently in the field of public health. I myself, as a doctorate student here, went into this field 7 years ago after undergraduate, extremely compassionate, and that was the direction in which my work in trying to understand public health came from. And I know myself that I've changed a lot. And I do think there's a lot of systematic errors that have led me to think the way that I do about public health now. And part of me feels that I cannot be evaluated in this field under the criteria that are required for compassion, but much more so for a certain methodological and interdisciplinary focus on how you carry out research, and that the idea of compassion being part of scientific research, that there is no room for it and that you can't evaluate compassion. And so I'm trying to understand how you think we could potentially change the American education system specifically to focus more on how we are producing people that can actually effectively understand the needs of those that are meeting a lot of the modern day health.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for that question, because it's very important to go beyond medicine, nursing, and the other health pressures, and look at public health and look more broadly at the healthcare system. Don't misinterpret anything that I've said. After all, you're looking at a Harvard professor, okay? This is my 39th year in the game. I believe in cognitive development and in strong professional skills. I demand it of my students and of myself. I want to see you the best trained public health person you can be technically. And I want to suggest that side by side with that technical skill, what Max Weber, the great German sociologist, called technical rationality, side by side with that technical skill, you also have a humanistic training. I think in schools of public health, this is very important, and right now the dean of our School of Public Health at Harvard, Julio Frank, who is a long-term friend of mine and someone I have great admiration for, is thinking of organizing public health education into components and having one section of it called the liberal arts of public health that might involve ethics, history, anthropology, sociology, and the other fields we feel contribute to public health. And then to have that liberal arts as something that you're responsible for, that is a liberal arts understanding, a humanistic understanding of the kinds of issues you're dealing with. And I would argue, rather than the emphasis being placed on solely on your compassion, a emotional and moral skill, a sensibility, if you will. Sensibility is a word we don't use today, traditionally meant emotion tied to value. Besides sensibility, that caregiving framing, that experience, that perspective, those skills, imagine if they were there side by side with that public health policy strength, with the research strength. I think would make you formidable and make any person coming out a great contributor. But I can tell you, in the book that I'm writing, at this stage of my life, why not? My ambition is much greater than that. What would a caregiving approach be to the area of security in the United States? What would a caregiving approach be to education? What would a caregiving approach be to any aspect of our lives? I want to argue for a much broader significance of caregiving, and for a simple reason, that all of us in the course of our lives have some experience with caregiving. Parents with children, all of us with acute illness, many of us, unfortunately, with chronic illness, some with the caring for people with very serious disabilities, end-of-life conditions. Hence, generalizing that, trying to get to its core components, and giving us a framework to be able to use that to look at our world raises very fundamental questions about what kind of world do we live in? What kind of world would we want to create? Can we bring those experiences, which are right there with us, can we bring them into the rest of our world? I think those are the broad issues that even go beyond the very excellent question you raised, to suggest that caregiving as a value and as an approach to life has broad significance. So thank you for that. Yes, please.
So I'll try to speak up. This sort of ties, a little bit ties the two questions together. You mentioned the sort of challenge for medical students in particular, where on one hand they have to close one eye perhaps, but keeping the other open, and whether you could say a little more about how self-care ought to or can play a role, and that may then be generalized to all of us.
Yeah. I don't know how much I should say on this because this is central to what my book is about.
Oh,
but I want you to read the book when it comes out. But I will say something that the logic of the book goes as follows. The first part of our human development is learning to take on cares. If we think of the etymology of caregiving, it actually begins with the idea of being troubled, taking on cares, being concerned, caring for others and for ourselves. As I watch my grandkids, I see a fundamental gender difference. I don't understand it, but I see it. I have 4 grandkids, 2 girls, 2 boys. The girls seem to learn earlier, seem to have somehow learned earlier how to take on these cares, and therefore how to take care of their lives, how to take care of the world around them. I don't know how gender enters into this, but part of it is clearly gendered in my mind. But independent of that, that movement from cares to taking care to giving care, I think is a spectrum of human development. Many of us can go through life with blockages to that development. Others move seamlessly through it. And I think that we just haven't paid enough attention to this to encourage it. A lot of it begins with recognition of our place in the world, what we need to worry about, how we take care of ourselves, how we take care of our lives, how we take care of the work that we... This taking care is what I see as the most important part of self-care. Then there's no question about the fact that when you're sick, self-care is a very, very important aspect of chronic illness. Osler said that nothing is as strong as an experience of chronic illness and taking care of yourself with a chronic illness to make you live a long life, he said. Because he felt that you learn something in chronic illness out of asthma, out of arthritis, out of all the chronic illnesses that makes you more attentive to taking care of your life, etc. And I think there's something, again, in that. The only part of self-care I'm a little concerned about, and you heard it in my words earlier, is that obviously we live in a phase of capitalism that's dominated by the neoliberal idea of markets and individuals. And the emphasis is placed on individuals as a way, actually, of reducing costs publicly and socially. And we moved away from the idea of social responsibility. So I'm all with you on self-care. I'm a little bit concerned myself about the political ramifications of that if we only emphasize self-care.
Thanks.
Yes?
Thank you so much for coming today and talking with us. I'm really impressed with how clearly you've defined caregiving and its importance in medical education and medicine in general. However, given the current economic context that healthcare exists in, of being in a capitalist nation where so much of the healthcare infrastructure is ruled by administrators, policymakers, insurance companies, those in charge of reimbursement, including the government itself, I think it would be easy to argue that a financial incentive would be imperative to improving the quality of caregiving in medicine. And do you agree with that? And if so, who's in a position to create that, and what might that look like?
Yeah, well, first of all, again, another great question. So it's a great audience, by the way. I fully agree with this idea of financial incentive. And I think that we're going to come to this laterally as we do all things. Of course, I mean, many of us believe that getting the for-profit motive out of health may be the most important thing that we can do in the future. And moving toward universal coverage, which even the WHO has come to accept as a standard for all societies, is something we should be working toward. But how do we incentivize caregiving? Well, let me just give you a few ideas. So 70% of the elderly in our society either live alone or with family. 30% live in some sort of institution. If there were a 10% change in the 70% who live with families or on their own, it would overwhelm all the institutions we have for the elderly. Now, we're on the way to this happening, actually, and it's being recognized. So I mentioned this earlier to some people, that Japan is leading the way in this regard. In 15 years, a little over 15 years, 40% of the Japanese population will be over 60 years of age. At that time, 30% of the Chinese population will be over 60 years of age. And China has a one-child family policy, so that the number of children caregivers for the elderly is going to be very small. We're headed in that regard, and we will have 20% of the population over 60 years of age. These societies have never existed before. They've never existed before. Large-scale societies with so many elderly have never existed before. Hence, the caregiving burden is going to be widely recognized as something that the institutional structures just simply in themselves are ill-equipped to be able to handle, even at their best. So where does this occur? The first thing is to move over resources toward network and family caregivers. Knowledge resources, well, that's beginning to happen, but in such a traditionally American, pluralistic, and unorganized way that it's more dangerous than helpful. If you send people to the internet now, half of what they learn, half of what they're seeing is entirely wrong. I remember when I graduated from medical school a long, long time ago, I was told in a very scientific medical school, half of what we're teaching you will prove to be wrong. Our problem is we don't know which half. Okay? In the world today, we do know which half is wrong right now. But our patients and people in society generally are routinely exposed to this without the knowledge resources to make sense of it. You almost have to have a degree from Hopkins in public health to read even material that is sent to you about your healthcare choices as part of some healthcare system. So improving that is going to be one of the ways of incentivizing. Really improving the knowledge resource, and then the financial resource, absolutely. Providing financial support of a more important kind. Well, let me give you, first of all, that should go to family and network healthcare providers, because they're doing the hard work of healthcare. And we have to think about how does that occur how can that occur? Tax incentives of some sort, reducing taxes of a variety of kinds, finding ways of actually transferring funds to those who are poor. Let me give you a sense of where this works in other countries. There are at least two outstanding examples of elder care based on home health aides in the world today, Norway and Japan. In both countries, home health aides are provided free to families that require them. Of course, you have to demonstrate, and it has to be assessed, that you have real needs in this regard. But then the home health aides are provided free. And these are trained home health aides. Trained and certified. Now, when I took care of my wife, Joan, for a decade, I had a fantastic home health aide. I couldn't possibly have done it without her. And she worked Monday to Friday, and as she said, I work 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, and you work 5 to 9 Monday to Friday, and then all day Saturday and Sunday. That's what I worked. If I didn't have her working 9 to 5 or some part of that, I could never have done that. I did that because I could afford it. I could financially afford it. Most people can't afford that. Even a few hours of home health aides they can't afford. So finding ways of providing home health aides and making sure that home health aides are certified, have met certain standards, and have the qualities that we want them to have. There are more than 1 million home health aides in the United States. They're one of the most rapidly growing part of our healthcare system. We know extremely little about them. We know that they often come from people of color, from minority groups. We know that they're often coming out of poor backgrounds. We know very little about their skill sets. We have few standards for them. And we know very little descriptively about the experiences. The experience I told you was an incredibly good one. I've had friends who've had terrible experiences with home health aides. Again, having those resources are not just the personal financial resources, they're also the financing of the right training and supervision and standardizing of home health care. I hope that gives you some ideas. We can talk later about, if you're interested, I've got other practical, more specific ideas, but I think that's going by far enough.
I think we are out of time,
Okay.
so please join me